There's a feeling most narcissists carry that they will never once say out loud, never fully acknowledge even to themselves, and almost certainly never admit to you directly, no matter how much time passes or how much distance grows between you. It isn't remorse in the way you'd recognize remorse from someone who genuinely understands what they did. It's something quieter, more defended, and in its own strange way, more permanent. Shame that never gets to fully surface, buried so deep beneath layers of self-protection that it functions almost entirely outside their own conscious awareness, even while it continues quietly shaping their behavior in ways they'd never connect back to its actual source. Let's start by understanding why this distinction, shame versus remorse, actually matters, because they're not the same experience. And confusing them leads to a lot of misplaced hope about what's actually happening inside someone who's hurt you. Remorse involves a clear, conscious recognition of wrongdoing, accompanied by genuine empathy for the person harmed, and typically followed by some meaningful attempt at repair. This is the version most people hope a narcissist is secretly experiencing, the version that would make sense of a future apology or a genuine change in behavior. Shame is different and considerably more complicated. Shame is a global, often unbearable feeling about the self. Not, I did something bad, but something closer to, I am something bad. And it's worth understanding that this specific quality of shame is often too threatening for a narcissist's fragile, externally regulated psychology to consciously access at all, precisely because fully feeling it would require confronting exactly the core insecurity their entire personality structure exists to protect against ever being fully felt. This is the crucial distinction worth understanding clearly. A narcissist can carry genuine shame about how he treated you without that shame ever translating into the conscious remorse, apology, or change you might reasonably hope it would eventually produce. The shame is real. Its inability to surface into something useful is also real, and understanding why requires looking closely at the actual architecture underneath narcissistic defense mechanisms. Here's the mechanism worth understanding in detail. We've discussed throughout this series that narcissism typically develops, at least in significant part, from early experiences of conditional love, a childhood environment where affection and approval were available reliably only when specific behaviors, achievements, or performances were delivered on cue. What gets absorbed from this kind of environment isn't simply, I need to perform to be loved. It's something deeper and more corrosive, a foundational belief that the authentic self, whatever exists underneath the performance, is fundamentally unacceptable. This belief, formed too early and too thoroughly to be consciously examined in adulthood, is the actual source of the shame we're discussing today. Not shame about any specific behavior toward you, but a much older, much more foundational shame about simply existing as who they actually are. Here's why this matters directly for understanding how they experience their treatment of you. When a narcissist hurts someone he's supposedly close to, the accurate, honest response would require him to sit with a specific, painful recognition. I did something that reflects poorly on who I actually am. But this recognition threatens to activate the much larger, much older shame we just described, the foundational belief that the authentic self is unacceptable, and that older shame is precisely what his entire defense system has been built since childhood, to protect against ever fully surfacing into conscious awareness. This means the specific shame about how he treated you doesn't get processed honestly and released the way it would in someone with a more secure, integrated sense of self. It gets absorbed into the larger, unprocessed reservoir of shame that's been accumulating, unaddressed, since long before you ever entered his life, then immediately automatically defended against through exactly the mechanisms we've discussed throughout this entire series: externalization, narrative reconstruction, and denial. This is worth understanding as the actual answer to a question a lot of empaths carry, often for years after a relationship like this ends. Does any part of him actually know what he did was wrong? The honest answer, based on how this psychology actually functions, is complicated but genuinely worth sitting with. Some part of him almost certainly registers it at some level below full conscious awareness. But that registration gets processed as an unbearable threat to his entire sense of self, rather than as useful, actionable information he could use to actually change, which means the shame exists genuinely, but it exists in a form that's almost entirely disconnected from anything resembling the productive guilt that leads to real accountability. Let's talk about what this buried shame actually looks like when it leaks out sideways, because it rarely stays fully contained, even when it never surfaces into anything resembling conscious acknowledgement. Understanding these leakage patterns matters because they're often the closest thing to evidence you'll ever actually witness that this shame is genuinely present, even though you'll likely never receive anything resembling a direct, honest admission of it. The first pattern worth recognizing is disproportionate defensiveness around specific topics, particularly ones connected to the relationship's ending or to specific incidents where the harm was most significant. You'll notice this especially if mutual connections ever mention the relationship casually, watching for a reaction that's considerably more intense than the casual mention would seem to warrant. This disproportion is worth understanding as diagnostic. A topic that's genuinely fully resolved for someone doesn't typically produce this level of defensive intensity when it comes up unexpectedly. The intensity reflects buried material that hasn't actually been processed, however much the surface level narrative claims otherwise. The second pattern is a specific kind of overcorrection in subsequent relationships, an exaggerated, sometimes almost performative display of the exact qualities he failed to demonstrate with you, deployed with a kind of urgency that goes beyond ordinary relationship effort. This might look like conspicuous, almost theatrical patience with a new partner, or vocal, repeated commitments to communication and emotional availability that seem calibrated more for an audience than for the actual relationship they're supposedly serving. This overcorrection is worth understanding as a specific kind of unconscious compensation, an attempt never consciously connected to its actual source, to prove something to himself that the buried shame is quietly, persistently demanding proof of. The third pattern, and this one is worth understanding carefully because it can be genuinely confusing to witness, is a tendency to bring up the relationship, unprompted, in contexts that seem to have nothing to do with it. A passing comment during an unrelated conversation, a reference that surfaces during a completely different discussion, sometimes even directed at people who have no connection to you or the relationship at all. This pattern reflects something psychologically significant. Unprocessed material tends to intrude, involuntarily, into unrelated moments, precisely because it hasn't been fully resolved and integrated the way processed, genuinely accepted experiences typically are. If something were truly settled, truly at peace, it wouldn't need to keep surfacing in contexts that have no obvious reason to trigger it. The fourth pattern worth understanding is a specific quality of restlessness that sometimes surfaces during quiet, unstructured moments. An inability to simply sit still with nothing demanding his attention, a compulsive need to fill silence with activity, noise, or new sources of stimulation. This connects directly to something we've discussed throughout this series. Unprocessed shame doesn't require conscious attention to exert real psychological pressure. It operates in the background, and one of its most common effects is precisely this kind of restlessness, a mind that's genuinely uncomfortable being alone with itself, because being alone with itself means being closer than usual to material it's spent enormous energy avoiding. Here's what's worth understanding about why none of these leakage patterns ever seem to resolve into the direct acknowledgement you might reasonably hope for, even when they accumulate clearly enough that the underlying shame seems almost undeniable to anyone watching closely. The entire defensive structure we've discussed throughout this series exists specifically to prevent exactly this kind of direct acknowledgement from ever occurring, and it's remarkably effective at its job precisely because it was built, starting in early childhood, around avoiding exactly this specific kind of exposure. This means even overwhelming evidence of buried shame accumulating across years and multiple relationships doesn't automatically translate into the moment of honest reckoning you might picture, because reaching that moment would require the defensive structure to fail completely. And as we've discussed in earlier videos throughout this series, that failure, while genuinely possible, remains relatively rare. Now let's talk about what this actually means for you, because understanding that this shame genuinely exists, buried and unacknowledged, is only useful if it changes something about how you carry this knowledge forward, rather than becoming one more thing you find yourself waiting for evidence of. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. Knowing that he's likely carrying real, unprocessed shame about how he treated you doesn't actually change anything about what you're owed or what you're allowed to require going forward. This is worth stating directly because there's a specific trap this knowledge can create if you're not careful with it, a subtle pull toward extending more patience, more understanding, more willingness to interpret his behavior charitably, simply because you now understand that some genuine suffering exists underneath the defensiveness. This trap deserves direct naming. His buried shame, however real, is not a debt you're required to help him pay down, and it's certainly not a reason to lower your own boundaries or reopen access you've correctly, protectively closed. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it connects to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series. This shame, even if it's genuinely present, doesn't function as evidence that change is imminent, or that continued patience on your part might finally be the thing that helps it surface into something productive. We've discussed at length why this specific hope, however understandable, usually leads to disappointment. Genuine change requires the shame to be consciously accessed and worked through, typically through sustained therapeutic engagement, and the entire defensive structure surrounding it exists specifically to prevent exactly that kind of access from occurring naturally, regardless of how much patience or love gets extended from outside. Here's what I actually want you to take from this discussion, more than any specific detail about how his shame manifests or leaks out sideways into behavior you might witness from a distance. This knowledge is meant to answer a question, not to give you something new to monitor. If part of what's kept you tethered to this story has been an unspoken worry that he simply doesn't feel anything at all, that he walked away from what happened between you completely untouched, completely unaffected, genuinely believing his own comfortable version of events without a single flicker of buried recognition underneath it. Understanding this mechanism should help settle that specific worry, even without ever providing you the satisfaction of witnessing direct confirmation. The shame is very likely there. It's real in the sense that psychologically well-supported mechanisms suggest it's genuinely present, in most cases matching this pattern, even though its intensity and its likelihood of ever surfacing varies considerably between individuals. What this knowledge should not become is a new reason to wait, watch, or hope for a moment of admission that may never arrive, regardless of how much buried shame is actually there. His shame, whether it eventually surfaces into something productive or remains permanently buried beneath defenses that never fail completely, was never actually the thing your own healing depended on. You don't need him to admit what he did in order to know it happened. You don't need his buried shame to surface into acknowledgement in order for your own experience of what occurred to be valid and complete, exactly as you already understand it. If you're currently holding this exact question, wondering whether any part of him actually knows what he did, whether he carries any real weight from how he treated you, whether all of this simply bounced off him without leaving a mark, I want you to hold two things simultaneously as we close this discussion. First, that the mechanism we've described today is genuinely well supported, and it's very likely that some form of this buried shame exists in him, whether or not you'll ever witness direct evidence of it. And second, that this understanding was always meant to be the end of your need for that evidence, not the beginning of a new, more informed version of waiting for it. He may never admit it. He may spend the rest of his life defended against ever consciously knowing it himself. Either way, what actually matters now is simply this. You already know what happened. You lived it clearly and accurately without needing his confirmation to trust your own memory of it. His shame, real or buried, admitted or defended against forever, was never actually the missing piece standing between you and your own complete, permanent peace. That peace was always something you were capable of building entirely on your own terms, regardless of what he ever finds the courage or fails to find the courage to face within himself. There's something else worth addressing directly here, because it's a question that tends to surface once people sit with this framework for a while. If this shame is genuinely real, doesn't that make him, in some sense, deserving of compassion rather than continued distance? This deserves a careful, honest answer, because it touches on something important about how you're allowed to hold complexity, without that complexity obligating you to anything. You can hold genuine compassion for the fact that he's likely carrying real, unprocessed pain, pain that predates you, pain that was never his fault to have received in childhood, pain that shaped him into someone capable of causing real harm without that shaping being something he consciously chose. This compassion can be entirely genuine and entirely appropriate, and at the exact same time, none of that compassion requires you to be the one who stays close enough to witness, absorb, or help resolve that pain. This is worth understanding as one of the more mature, more difficult distinctions available to you. You can feel real sorrow for the wounded child who became this person while holding complete, unwavering clarity that the adult he became is still fully responsible for what he did with that wound, and that your role was never to be the site of his healing, regardless of how much unprocessed shame he might be carrying underneath his defenses. This distinction matters enormously because a lot of empaths, upon learning frameworks like the one we've discussed today, experience a specific pullback toward the relationship, not because anything has actually changed about his behavior or his willingness to change, but because understanding the wounded origin of harmful behavior can create a kind of retroactive softening that feels like compassion, but functions in practice as a doorway back into exactly the dynamic you worked so hard to leave. I want to name this pull directly because it's genuinely common, and recognizing it in yourself if it arises is far more useful than being caught off guard by it later. Here's a way to hold both truths without letting one collapse into permission for the other. Imagine encountering a stranger who was clearly wounded as a child, clearly carrying real, unprocessed shame from an origin they never chose, and clearly, as an adult, still causing real harm to the people close to them without seeking help to address it. Compassion for that stranger's origin story doesn't obligate you to become close to them, doesn't require you to offer yourself as the person who helps them heal, doesn't mean their unprocessed pain functions as a claim on your time, your safety, or your continued presence in their life. The same logic applies here, even though it's harder to hold when the person in question isn't a stranger, but someone you once loved and were once genuinely close to. Understanding his pain doesn't create an obligation. It simply allows you to hold a more complete, more honest picture of what actually happened between you, without that completeness requiring anything further from you at all. Here's something else worth understanding because it connects to a broader pattern this entire series has addressed repeatedly. The specific relief of finally understanding that his shame is real can sometimes create a subtle temptation to become invested in eventually witnessing its surface, checking for signs, watching for evidence through mutual connections, treating any report of him seeming different or going through something as potential confirmation that the buried material we've discussed today is finally breaking through. I want to address this temptation directly because it's worth recognizing as its own specific trap, distinct from simply wanting to know whether justice, broadly speaking, is being served. If you find yourself drawn into this kind of watching, it's worth asking honestly what you're actually hoping to receive from it. Often, underneath the surface level curiosity, there's a genuine, understandable hope that his eventual reckoning with this buried shame will somehow retroactively validate what you went through, proof finally that it mattered, that you weren't overreacting, that the harm was real enough to leave a permanent mark on the person who caused it. This hope is completely human and completely understandable, but it's worth naming clearly that you don't actually need this confirmation in order for what you experienced to already be fully valid. You know what happened. You lived through the specific incidents, the specific patterns, the specific cost to your own well-being with a clarity that doesn't require his internal experience buried or eventually surfaced to confirm anything at all. His shame existing or not existing, or eventually surfacing or remaining permanently defended against, changes nothing about the accuracy of your own memory and your own experience of what actually occurred. This is ultimately the most protective way to hold everything we've discussed throughout this entire video as genuine, useful information about how this specific kind of psychology tends to function, offered to answer a question you may have carried for a long time without that information becoming a new project, a new thing to track, a new reason to remain oriented toward his internal experience rather than fully, completely toward your own life going forward. The shame is very likely there. It changes nothing about what you're owed, what you're allowed to require, or how completely valid your own experience already is, entirely independent of whether he ever finds his way to consciously knowing what you've known about him clearly and accurately this entire time.